Welcome, everybody. Shall start. I'm Oliver Gerstenberg, and I will be chairing the event today with Silvia. And my position is here entirely redundant because Silvia is globally known as a scholar, so she doesn't need any introduction. So Silvia is, as you know, a professor at the European University Institute since 24. And so she relatively recently started there, and she has the chair there for comparative constitutional law, constitutional theory, and gender law. And her expertise is also on Eastern Europe, and she shot to fame. I mean, she was always famous, but shot to fame, particular fame. When she published her monograph on eternity clauses, you see, and in Democratic Constitutionalism, which was published at OUP in 21, and for which she received the Icon Book Prize in 23. And before all that, we were office neighbors, and so we both started simultaneously at UCL Laws many years ago in 2016, and so we, from office door to office door, we often complained about the state of the world. And, but now we are not complaining today. We are all in a cheerful mood, and we will listen to Silvia's presentation on Romania, Romania's presidential elections, and in the militant democracy key. So we will have both topics, something about Romania and something about militant democracy, something conceptual. And I need not say anything about the importance of this topic. You have all seen what's happening in Poland just a few days ago. So it looks all pretty grim. So we are privileged to have Silvia as an expert who can look at Romania both from the outside and the inside. Would you please take the floor?
Thank you very much. Well, it's a great pleasure and an honor to be back. Thank you for arranging the web for me to remind me what I'm missing out on, and also to set the mood for the talk today. I do have a PowerPoint, so Chris can help me maybe just put it there, mainly for a few timelines and key points to share, and also to highlight that, you know, the title for today is Romania's presidential elections in a militant democracy key ? And I would encourage you to help me think whether that is the right key in which to read what happened at the end of last year, when infamously the Constitutional Court of Romania annulled the whole presidential elections process and ordered a rerun. Now the rerun happened this spring, and we narrowly missed a scenario that we now have seen unfold in Poland. So question mark, just because, you know, this is in a way a preliminary framework to consider for this. And it's also a very prevalent framework that I keep hearing from people who sort of have heard and even studied the process as well. But let's go back to 2024. This was a super election year, not just in Romania, but globally. But certainly in Romania, what happened was a conflation of pretty much all level elections. So in June, we had European elections as well as local elections. Then in November, on November 24th, there was the first round of presidential elections. Second round planned for the 8th of December, so 2 weeks later, but in the interim, the weekend between them, we had parliamentary elections as well. So, and this was not a coincidence. You know, the government in charge of planning sort of decided it to be this way, and it also decided to decouple the presidential elections and parliamentary elections so that you'd have the parliamentary ones after the first round of presidential elections. I mean, you see, if you some interesting characters there, and also Romania socialist symbol for one of the candidates, but that's besides the point here. I wanted to also give an abbreviated, simplified timeline, and it's already quite busy, but there's even more that could have gone on this, but I thought let's not overburden you with facts and dates and things. But in a way, what I want to talk about today starts before the presidential election first cycle even happened. It starts with the candidates needing to register their candidacies, and it starts with the Constitutional Court intervening in the process on the 5th of October, when it invalidated one of the candidacies. Now, the candidate in question is a infamous, fair to say, so far, populist politician in Romania who leads a party. She's an MEP as well, and she's infamous for all sorts of statements and positions and actions that come out in favor of Russia, glorifying the fascist Iron Guard from the interwar period, you name it. So not a delightful character, but we'll talk a little bit about that case and that decision of the Constitutional Court in just a moment, because I think that is actually significant and potentially in the long run more significant than the annulment of the presidential elections. But on November 24th, we have the first round of elections, the surprise win, coming on top of Călin Georgescu, a relative unknown on the political scene, previously associated with one of the parliamentary populist parties, but since having left it and sort of presenting himself as an independent anti-system populist candidate. He comes up on top, and on the second slot, we have Elena Lasconi, the candidate for a pro-European center-right, one may say, liberal party UCL. And all the leaders of established parties that have been in government, don't make it to the second round. There are complaints lodged with the Constitutional Court 3 days later. 2 complaints, one alleging electoral fraud per the law on presidential elections. And that law requires some sort of proof that whatever electoral irregularities happened affected the actual ranking of the candidates. The other alleged campaign finance breaches by Călin Georgescu, because by the time the first election round happened, he had to declare his spending and declared zero spending, which is a bit rich, bit bold. But so those were the 2 complaints lodged, and they had to be lodged within the 3-day timeline that the law prescribes. In response, the Constitutional Court on November 28th ordered a ballot recount, recounting all the ballots. And this was an administrative nightmare because electoral commissions for each of the what do you call them? Well, anyway, they had been dismantled and everything, but they had to try to do it. Significantly, the ballot recount was ordered for the votes cast nationally, so not abroad. And this is, there were hundreds of thousands of ballots that have been cast abroad. They were sort of at different stages of being repatriated, and those wouldn't be recounted in any case. On December 1st, you have parliamentary elections, and then the sort of pro-European parties narrowly gain the cumulatively narrowly gain the higher number of votes. But our populist party, biggest populist party, and some of the other parties that would be sort of far-right populist parties also make significant gains, rounding up at around 32%. So, significant parliamentary victory. And then by December 2nd, the Constitutional Court actually certified the first round of presidential elections. So they actually said, the vote would go on. So they reject the 2 complaints lodged. And after that, 2 days later, the evening of 4th of December, the president of the country declassified some reports by secret services that revealed electoral interference, or claimed to reveal it, and a very sophisticated disinformation campaign. Now, those were declassified the evening, if I remember correctly, of the 4th. And then the Constitutional Court intervened once again, and as I'll explain, ex officio and outside of any time limits that the law might prescribe, and decided on the afternoon of the 6th of December, Friday, to annul the whole presidential election process and ordered a redo. It's also interesting to note that the voting had already begun abroad. So I had actually voted. I have, some proof that I voted in an election round that never actually finished. Now, let's see. It's hard to underestimate or to overemphasize how surprising the results were. And I thought I'd do so by an appeal to numbers. On the left-hand side is an opinion poll from October last year that showed kind of what the political estimates were. And the estimates were that the Social Democratic candidate, also Prime Minister at the time, would comfortably go through in the second round of parliamentary elections. And then the real battle would be for second place. And their estimates were that the leader of the Populist Party, George Simeon, whom you now know, perhaps if you followed, to have been in the run-up this year in the elections, they estimated that he might make it, but it wasn't clear, right? And nowhere there do you see Călin Georgescu. He was below 1% of voting intention. And then on the right-hand side are the actual results, right, where he came to almost 23% of the votes. So this is a meteoric rise, very suspicious. And the reports, the declassified reports, which for your benefit, I have spent this week rereading, track that rise from below 1% in October to about 6%, I think, mid-November, to a little over 10% 2 days before the elections. So, they had means to track it, and he still hadn't come to 23%. But even so, a 10% rise in the span of a month is unprecedented, and let alone 23%. And I'll also point out for you to remember later, I don't think this will work, but you see all of the candidates. The two people who would end up challenging the result are the ones in 9th place and 12th place. Part that knowledge for now. So maybe we can start with the annulment decision, because it is, well, it's just interesting. And then we'll go back in time to the October one, and you'll see in a moment why. So I've already mentioned that it's an ex officio decision, not judgment, decision. It's not that the Constitutional Court cannot intervene ex officio on some carefully prescribed grounds. The law on the functioning of the Constitutional Court, lists the instances in which it can, it doesn't need to be seized by anyone. It can intervene, for instance, when it comes to constitutional amendment review. But it says nothing about doing so in the case of presidential elections. In a prior decision, the court had stated that it saw its role in the certification of presidential elections as encompassing, sort of overseeing the whole electoral process, but it was still unclear on what ground the Constitutional Court could actually intervene after the time limits had passed, with no one seizing it, to actually go so far as to annul the whole presidential election process. But what you have here are the two constitutional provisions that the court relied on to sort of ground its authority for annulling elections. One is part of the provision that lists its competences. So it's Article 146F, says that the Constitutional Court as one of its functions to ensure the observance of the procedure prescribed for the election of the President of Romania and to confirm the election results. Up until this point, this entailed sort of, a very straightforward control that the process was, lawful, and that all of the formal and some of the substantive conditions were met. Those substantive conditions never expanded to what I think would come to mean in this context. And it also grounded its intervention in another provision, Article 142.1, which declares the Constitutional Court to be the guarantor of the supremacy of the Constitution. There is actually a separate competence that the court has to declare political parties unconstitutional, but that is separate and was not the case here and not part of what what the court built its argument on. And as I've already mentioned, the law, so in legislation, there was also a ground to annul for fraud, but that also isn't the ground that was invoked here. It had already been dismissed as a ground invoked by one of the complaints. And it's also not a ground here because actually what these declassified reports showed wasn't actually voter fraud. People actually voted this way, right? So it wasn't that votes were stolen or that there was interference with the infrastructure as such. The allegations, or rather the evidence that the report showed, was about an online campaign, mainly on TikTok, and disinformation, as well as campaign finance breaches, but none of that amounting to actual voter fraud. So this couldn't be the ground for the court intervening. Oops. There we go. Okay, I'm getting it. So what were the grounds for annulment that the Constitutional Court ultimately invoked? There were two. One, what it called the algorithmic abuse and disinformation. And for this, it talked about how, the significant exposure of one candidate led to disadvantaging the other candidates. It talked about the resulting lack of equality between candidates. And to me, it's very interesting because it's almost like it sort of applies the same logic that used to apply or applies in the case of standard traditional media, right? The idea that you have equal airtime and an equal opportunity to make your case to the public, and it applied it or sought to apply it to the online campaign world. That's up for discussion whether that's necessarily a realistic expectation. But for this ground in particular, well, actually for the second as well, the court really relied on these declassified reports. And the reports might even be putting it too strongly. They're informal notes, right? And there's some problems with them. Some of them are annexes to reports that weren't declassified. Some of them sometimes contradict each other on a few points. For example, the service responsible for sort of the electronic infrastructure behind the voting actually came out and said, we were fine. There was no irregularity. And the fact that the voting still happens on paper actually allows us to say that with a certain degree of certainty and confidence that we can double check. And this is, the voting itself was actually lawful and not tampered with. So because ultimately the equality between the candidates was deemed to have been affected, the court said, we need to annul the whole process. And it was also concerned with reestablishing public trust in the democratic legitimacy of public authorities. This comes at toward the end. It's not a long decision, it's a couple pages, and that's kind of it. When it came out, people asked me, what is in there? What is in there that we don't get? Because they thought, the reports were sort of probably not doing justice to some sort of very lengthy, robustly reasoned decision, but it really wasn't. It was sort of a last hour intervention to stop a process from going forward that the court and many public institutions and also many in wider society thought was a vitiated process. So, to me, for now, what I'll say is that this was a very a difficult situation for the court, right? It's very much has been written on this decision, and many people have come out and criticized, the legal grounds and the reasoning, and that's all valid, but it's very obvious that it was a very difficult situation and that the court was asked, it was in a way the only institution left who might have the levers to intervene to stop an election that really many thought shouldn't have gone forward, out of time, ex officio, etc. Now, if we go back in time a little bit to also why the court's intervention may have been problematic also from the perspective of the degree of trust and legitimacy that the court overall enjoys in society. We have this October 5th decision. I call it the Choshwaka decision because that's the name of the MEP who, sought to register her candidacy for the presidential elections, and initially was registered as a candidate, but then 2 complaints alleging some formal and substantive irregularities with her candidacy. And the Constitutional Court in that decision, which is much longer, so if you're looking, for militant democracy, that's the decision to look at, rather than the December one. And it starts by adopting a holistic interpretation of the Constitution, and then lays out what it calls an axiological framework in which the presidential elections are to take place. It says that it is not just bound by the law, it's not just limited to engaging in a control of legality, but needs to engage in control of constitutionality of these candidacies. And as I said, this is where there's a lot of militant democracy language. The court talks about, quote, the effective defense and protection of democracy. It talks about the would-be candidate abusing her functions as an MEP, advocating for leaving NATO and the European Union, which is against the Constitution, the court argues, because these have been constitutionalized and Romania's Euro-Atlantic path and commitments are subject to a non-regression clause, which cannot go back on European destiny and trajectory of Romania. It talks about, that Mr. Schraker cannot use democratic means to overturn the democratic order. It talks a little bit about constitutional identity as well, and her sort of breaching through statements and actions, public statements and actions over the years, acting against this constitutional identity and acting in an anti-constitutional manner in their perspective. Now, what the legal move is to allow them to essentially disqualify her is to look at the oath of office that the president has to take. And this is an oath that, whose text is entrenched and is known, and it talks about all sorts of things, among which the Constitutional Court extracts 2, the obligation to respect the Constitution and the obligation to defend democracy. And it reads these as 2 substantive conditions for registering a candidacy. So it moves them from, becoming the duties incumbent upon the president when in office and when, having sworn the oath, and sort of backdates them, saying they apply even before taking this oath. So unsurprisingly, then Mr. Schraker is deemed ineligible on account of her public statements and actions for changing the constitutional fundamentals of the state and breaching the constitutional order. So, as I said, to me, this is a much more problematic precedent set by the Constitutional Court. It is a move that has been criticized rightly, I think, by many, not just scholars, but also the sole dissenting judge in the decision, who said, listen, this is essentially creating a substantive condition for the right to stand for presidential elections out of the oath of office, nowhere written as a condition before, and creating a dangerous precedent as well. And this is an interesting maybe argument in a comparative constitutional law perspective, what the dissenting judge argued and what I've heard people discuss then also vis-a-vis the December decision, turning, the judge said, this majority decision turned what is supposed to be an abstract review into a concrete review, right? That they went from abstractly reviewing the lawfulness of her candidacy, for meeting all of the criteria as set out in law and in the Constitution, to concretely reviewing her fitness for office and deeming her unfit, but on the basis, again, of public actions and statements which, reprehensible though they may have been, didn't actually result in, any sort of criminal sanction or anything that would have deemed her ineligible based on the law. And also highlighted by this dissenting judge, this concrete review was engaged in without any consideration for the due process guarantees that the candidate would have. So because this is an abstract review, the parties that are directly affected, in this case, Mr. Schraker, are not present before the court. They cannot make their case. They cannot, challenge anything that's been presented or said about them. Now, she has challenged this decision before Strasbourg, but in that case, I don't know if it's even been communicated yet. So that will take some time. And either way, it's, obviously the elections have passed. Now, this might be triggering to any Romanians in the audience, but I thought you might want to see these two candidates on the right-hand side. So, well, Călin Georgescu, taking his cues from imagery and symbolism from Romanian folklore, bit of inspiration from, Putinesque-like masculinity and virility, one man and nature and animals. And on the left-hand side is Ms. Șoșoacă being escorted out of the European Parliament with a muzzle on her face, and then the icon that she's brandishing, yelling that she's being muzzled and prevented from really speaking her mind and becoming being seen as a threat and being taken out of the electoral game. And again, however we feel about her statements, I think it is true that she was actually, prevented as part of. Well, anyway, I won't say that, but she was credited to have around 6% of the vote when the decision came about. So you can't say that this was a completely insignificant political player. Now, when we get to the militant democracy part, I promised a bit of fact and a bit of norm. So is militant democracy the right frame to analyze all of this in? And I'm curious to know what you think. On the one hand, they said, it could be seen as militant democracy in action. We can go back to Paul Löwenstein's conception and the German kind of constitutional instantiation of militant democracy with the focus on political rights, party bans, rights restrictions on those who undermine the constitutional order, the right to resistance. That would be the framework, the initial framework to think about militant democracy in. But I find it very interesting that we live in times when the political theorists have also found new interest in militant democracy as a theory and are trying to put it on more robust normative foundations as well. And one example of that is Ben Schuppen's book, Democracy Despite Itself, where that's exactly what he tries to do. He says, we need a solid sort of liberal normative theory of militant democracy. He says classic militant democracy was too focused on political rights and party bans in particular as the tool to use against democracy's foes. It relies on too thin of a conception of democracy, which then makes it or leaves it vulnerable to people claiming, for instance, to be liberal Democrats, to take over occupy the space. But he says it's also too weak on sort of the militant part of militant democracy, right? That the tools are too narrowly construed. And actually what he ends up arguing for is more entrenchment, up to and including unamendability, constitutional unamendability, and courts and court intervention, more robust court intervention. Now, to me, this is very interesting to consider in light of the Romanian example. What's new in this framework if we consider the case that we've just talked about? I think disinformation as the threat is new. And if you look at these attempts to reconceptualize militant democracy, there's very little on disinformation, at least that I found, including in this book. It's sort of the elephant in the room and yet not addressed. And I don't think, for all that we might be otherwise, sympathetic to these attempts to revitalize militant democracy, but it's not, I don't think, something that can be fixed with entrenchment and courts, right? It's even less so when you consider the foreign interference dimension of it, which I realize now I haven't said very much about, but I can do so in the Q&A, right? It seems to me very, very significant that this was not a case of vote rigging, right? It was a case of lawfully cast votes by people who had been manipulated, disinformed, etc., but not in a way that is obviously, or that was obviously unlawful. And then there's also, as I said, the foreign interference aspect where, the militant democratic tools need to be able to stave off an enemy that is both within and without, and sometimes, without, but in very, very tricky constellations and very difficult to prove. So there's very little on disinformation in these new theories of militant democracy that I've seen. And also we have a different problem, which is militant democratic tools or militant democracy as a framework being used for anti-democratic purposes itself, right? And this is not something new. People have written about this, including Tom Ginsburg and Nancy's Hook in their book, now old, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, and had already warned about this risk. There are other people who have written about this. There are people who write, for instance, about what do they call it? Neo-militant democracy. There's a political theorist in Poland called Joanna Rack who writes about this very interestingly in contexts such as Hungary, right, where militant democratic tools are harnessed against opposition leaders, right, and this mantle of militant democracy is then, one could say, abused, one could say manipulated, but certainly we have to face off that there is this risk on the table as well. And in my mind, the Constitutional Court decision from October might actually fit into a framework like this as well, right, where militant democracy was invoked and used as the foil for what is a very problematic from a democratic point of view decision. So what would be the alternative then? That's a failure, by the way. Is this just a case of all institutional failure? This is something we are Romania very used to complaining about, institutions that don't do their jobs late, do their job, well, imperfectly. Because really, if you draw the line, the legal framework for doing more, if not completely preventing the scenario, was there. Electoral law itself has campaign finance rules. There's rules against disinformation. There's the EU framework and some mechanisms against disinformation that have been in place and have been in place already in part, at least up to the December. There's now a new executive ordinance that was passed in January in direct response to the saga that has actually, in the name of fighting disinformation, has introduced new means through which to try to regulate online political advertising. And what's happened in practice has been that it's overreaching. So, regular people have had their Facebook posts removed, being deemed political actors engaging in political speech that's not branded as political speech in part of the campaign. So there's all of that, but the legal framework for whatever gaps it might have had was there. Romania has electoral accountability bodies, has an electoral commission, that was also seized earlier, at least, by the 27th, I think, of November, by civil society actors concerned and with evidence of campaign finance abuses, etc. It didn't do anything. The secret services have been criticized for being slow to act. And again, having looked back on these informal notes, Călin Georgescu was on the radar for years, since 2020 at the very least, for suspicious activity on TikTok. Now, he probably was deemed low risk because nobody had heard about him. But this wasn't someone who completely came out of the blue, right? And if they had done their job, at least one would have hoped that they could have released these reports earlier, at least before the court had initially certified the first round of elections. So there's a lot more to say. What is not on there, and I think might be of interest to some of you, is that I think this is also a failure of mainstream political parties. And let me explain why. What came out after the election is that the Social Democrats and the National Liberal Party, which had been in coalition government, taking turns at giving the prime minister for the whole of the former parliamentary, so they had formed the government for 4 years prior, had both been involved in supporting who they thought would be the runner-up, George Simeon, so the leader of the populist party. The Social Democrats had sort of redirected votes to him in key constituencies to try to ensure that he would be the runner-up against their candidate, knowing that that was the only scenario in which the former prime minister would win the elections. And this is actually a not unprecedented scenario in Romanian politics, which in 2000 had, President Iliescu running against a, well, now it seems like a proto-populist far-righter, and winning by a landslide because people were really worried. So that was what the Social Democrats had done and what the National Liberal Party had done, and is now sort of proven to have done, is breach campaign finance rules and actually funding the online TikTok campaign that had led to this whole mess, right? So they were in on it, is at least a valid assumption to make based on that evidence. And also there's deep distrust in state institutions, and I think in large part justified. And there's deep distrust of the Constitutional Court as well. And all of this predates 2024. But it is in that context that this decision came about, and coupled with the ex officio and with the out of time intervention while voting in abroad had already begun, that really made the intervention seem, well, highly risky if you're being charitable, or politicized and potentially an attempt to prevent the people from expressing their vote if you're not. And here's an alternative potential framework. Some of you might remember Michaela Heilbronner had come here 2 years ago already, or maybe 1 year. I don't know. What is time? And she has a forthcoming book on arguments from failure, where she argues that in some instances, where there's institutional failures, that might actually justify the expansion of institutional competence, those institutions that are left to be able to sort of take the mantle. And I've been wondering whether this is actually a more useful or more precise framework to capture at least part of what happened in Romania as well. Now, to conclude and get to the discussion, which I'm much more interested in, second time's the charm. We had the rerun. On the right hand there, you have George Simeon. On the left is Călin Georgescu. Simeon, very interestingly, actually claimed that he was kind of the stand-in. I mean, he was running because Georgescu had since been disqualified on the basis of the same December decision. So when he tried to re-register his campaign or his candidacy, it was rejected, even though the December decision hadn't actually named him, right? So, but everybody knew what the decision was about. So he couldn't run anymore. Simeon took over, tried to portray him as his, not a successor, but placeholder, saying this is really his presidency, and I will make sure he comes back as prime minister and give the people what they want. Didn't work out that way. We ended up with the now former mayor of Bucharest and elected, but it's time will tell what this victory means. I think we narrowly escaped a very dangerous scenario, and I'm not saying that this isn't the right outcome. Of course it is. He won with a much more comfortable majority than we had expected, almost 55%. But he is inheriting very difficult economic legacy, high deficit. It's still unclear what the government, will look like, whether he'll have to govern with a minority government or not. And it's still, to me, extremely worrying that there wasn't more than 45% of Romanian citizens voted for the far-right populist candidate. So all of those people who thought, this was a fluke, and who might have thought that the disinformation was the sole culprit for what's rotten in Romanian politics, I think are wrong. And I think there's something that needs to be done about the 45% that actually thought, leaving pro-West, pro-European, pro-democratic track is the way to go.
Thank you, Silvia.
Thank you very much.
A big round of applause.